But here's the thing, that feeling of like intense negative rumination, boredom, discomfort, that is in large part withdrawal from the hyperstimulation and all the dopamine. And that means it's time limited. And if we can just continue to abstain from that reinforcing substance or behavior for 10 to 14 days, our brains will eventually calm down enough where we will be able to be in a kind of mental state that is, in fact, potentially very joyful and calm and settled and quiet. And also a state where we have a real opportunity for insight and creativity, which is, by the way, less likely and less possible when we're constantly in reactive mode, constantly responding to external stimuli. And there's been some really interesting neuroscientific work on this, looking at the difference in brain activation when we're responding to external stimuli versus when we're sitting quietly. And that sitting quiet state, often referred to by neuroscientists as the default mode network or the DMN, it's characterized by actually a kind of a synchronous symphony of brain activation across many different parts of the brain, consolidating a lot of our rich sensory, emotional, and cognitive experience, allowing us to integrate it all so that we can really have a sense of our past, current, and future selves and gain wisdom and insight, which we really don't have access to when we're just constantly going bing, 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 reacting to everything around us. So at first it hurts, there's no doubt about it, and it's uncomfortable, but stay with it. Have faith that by continuing to live in that quieter way, you will get to a place where you will experience some deep connection with yourself, with others, with the universe. It's a very cool thing.
Hello, friend, and welcome to episode 107 of the Intentional Leader Podcast. I'm Cal, and I hope that you're doing well today. I'm really excited to share today's conversation with Dr. Anna Lembke. Dr. Lembke is the New York Times bestselling author of Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. She's a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine, and she's the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. Dr. Lembke was also featured on the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, a deep dive into the impact of social media on our lives. We cover a lot of ground in today's episode. We discuss the role of dopamine in addiction. If you don't know what dopamine is, we'll talk about that. The rise of digital addictions, what to do if you or someone in your life is struggling with an addiction, how to rediscover the joy of life's most simple activities, and much more. On this podcast, I want to help you live a life that aligns with your deepest values. And I think that this conversation is really important in this cultural moment that we find ourselves. In my opinion, it's never been easier to get distracted and even addicted to activities that don't align with your deepest values and the life that you want. And this is really important for leaders to understand, both personally, and then it's also important to understand how addictive behaviors affect the people you lead, members of your team, and even people in your family. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do me a big favor and share it with someone you know. Also, if you want to make sure to get future conversations, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. And without any further ado, please enjoy this important conversation with Dr. Anna Lembke. All right, Dr. Lembke, I am so excited to have you on the Intentional Leader Podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
I first discovered your work, actually, with my wife. She was traveling in an airport, picked up your book, and I think she read it in 2 flights. And then she came back and passed the book on to me, and I consumed it in probably 48 hours.
Wow.
And it's just such a good book. I think when I first learned about dopamine, I was reading some of Cal Newport's work about social media and just the dangers of that, while trying to figure out my own relationship with my phone and social media and streaming devices, and just feeling like, man, I'm spending way too much time on this. And so I just appreciate that you're putting a lot of your research into the world. So first of all, thank you for writing this book.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
So you ask a question in the book, and it's a big question. And I was hoping we could kind of start here because it kind of gets at our modern challenge with just the world that we live in. And you say, why in a time of unprecedented wealth, freedom, technological progress, and medical advancement do we appear to be unhappier and in more pain than ever before? So it's like this interesting dichotomy where we're wealthier than we ever were, and yet it seems like we're more anxious than we ever were, and addiction is on the rise. So I wonder if you could just kind of frame our conversation by speaking into this moment that we're kind of all experiencing as humans.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have evolved over millions of years of evolution for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. We're really not well suited for the world that we live in now, which is a world that we've created. You're probably familiar with the term the Anthropocene, this idea that we're living in the first time in human history where human behavior changes the planet and changes the environment. Mm-hmm. And we often associate that with, pollution. Some talk about climate change, but the other major way that we've changed our environment is that we have essentially leveraged science and technology to meet all of our basic survival needs. And then above and beyond that, we have drugified almost every human experience, meaning that we've made it more pleasurable, more potent, more accessible, more bountiful, more novel, such that we're all constantly bombarding this ancient reward pathway with these intensely rewarding substances and behaviors. And our brains really were not designed for that. And as a result, our brains are reeling, trying to compensate, and are compensating by essentially downregulating production and transmission of feel-good neurotransmitters. That's at least, my hypothesis of why it is that this kind of pursuit of pleasure ultimately leads to pain. And we have lots of good neuroscience suggesting that that's the case. And we have some interesting epidemiology suggesting, too, that the wealthier the nation, the more unhappy, depressed, and suicidal its citizens. So it's really a paradoxically difficult time to be human.
Why do you think that is? Because I don't have to go cut wood to make a fire and then have heat. I can just turn on my heat. I don't have to go to the grocery store, or I don't have to go kill food to have food. I can go to the grocery store, or I can even just sit on my couch and have food delivered to me. So it seems like we would be happier. We have more, it seems like we would have more time to do leisure activities, which seem like the things that we really want in our life. We want to sit on the beach. We want to sit back and just watch TV, which seems like in the moment that it's making us happy, but it's not. So why with more time are we not happier?
Yeah, it's a real puzzle, and it's super counterintuitive. But I think to understand it, it's essentially to understand how our brains process pleasure and pain. We reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain. It's just, we don't have to think about that. That is how we're wired. It's what has kept us alive over millions of years of evolution. But the problem is that we have now created such an environment of pleasure that this reflexive approaching of pleasure puts us in a physiologic imbalance. And one of the ways I talk about that is to sort of talk about how our brains process pleasure and pain and the way that they work like opposite sides of a balance. And one of the overarching sort of mandates governing all living organisms is the return to homeostasis, or a level balance. And the way that our brains return to that level balance is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. So, for example, imagine like a seesaw or a teeter-totter in your brain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way, pain the other. But the sort of governing rule of that balance is that with any deviation from neutrality, our brains are going to work very hard to return to a level balance. And the way our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. So this is called an opponent process mechanism. But what it means is that when we do something pleasurable, that releases dopamine in the reward pathway, balance tips to the side of pain, but our brain immediately adapts, downregulates production and transmission of dopamine and other feel-good neurotransmitters, not just to baseline, but below baseline. And that sets us up for the state of craving and wanting more. Now, in a world of scarcity, that is a highly adaptive mechanism, right? Because I walk tens of kilometers to get food. I get the food, I eat it, I feel better for a while, but not too long. And then I'm wanting, and then I work again and keep going. But what happens if, one way I think of this mechanism and the neuroadaptation process is to imagine these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until we're tilted and equal an opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the hangover, the come down, that moment of craving one more drink or one more TikTok video or what have you. Mm-hmm. Now, if I don't indulge again, the gremlins get the memo that their job is done. They hop off the pain side of the balance and homeostasis is restored. Dopamine levels go back to baseline healthy firing. Dopamine is our reward and pleasure neurotransmitter. But if I continue to consume that highly reinforcing substance or behavior over days to weeks to months to years, those metaphorical gremlins start to multiply and get bigger and stronger. And pretty soon, I've changed my hedonic or joy set point. Now I'm walking around with a pleasure-pain balance that's tilted to the side of pain. I'm in a chronic dopamine deficit state. Now I need more of my drug in more potent forms, not to feel pleasure, but just to feel normal and level the balance. And when I'm not using, I'm experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. So the hypothesis is that because we are living in a world where we're surrounded by so many reinforcing substances and behaviors, from that first cup of coffee in the morning to our digital devices, to our Netflix shows at night and everything in between, that we're bombarding our reward pathway with so much dopamine that our brains have been forced to downregulate dopamine transmission, putting us in a physiologic state which is akin to a clinical depression. So what feels like the pursuit of pleasure and is the pursuit of pleasure ultimately leads to this pain state, but also one that we don't link up to our pursuit of pleasure. Like we're not very good at seeing causality. In fact, we see that when I use again, it levels the balance. I feel better, right? So I need to keep doing that. In fact, that's self-medicating, my anxiety and depression. It's medicinal for me. We're not able to appreciate, because it happens in a slow and iterative process over days to weeks to months, that really we're contributing to anhedonia, or the inability to experience any pleasure at all.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I can't remember the name of the patient that you talk about in the book who was using cannabis and thought that it was experiencing anxiety and thought that the cannabis would help with the anxiety. And then throughout the treatment and the time in your clinic, she was able to discover, well, actually, by abstaining from cannabis for a little while, she realized, oh my goodness, my anxiety has subsided, and this was actually causing the anxiety. But we're not great at being able to connect those things. So I wonder if you could just coach me for a second. So one of the things that I recall, one of my first experiences with maybe dopamine, or just feeling concerned about my use of a particular drug. And I know that it's easy to think, first of all, it's easy for us to think that those who are addicted are kind of those people that are in treatment, are having to go to serious detox experiences. First, I wonder if you could just speak to that to kind of ground the conversation. Do you think we are all susceptible to addictions, and should we be careful to kind of think, oh, well, that couldn't be me? Because it seems like what you're describing is a world where we just haven't lived in this type of world before. Whereas in the past, there were things like, of course, substances and other opportunities to get addicted. But now it's like this thing in my pocket, I could easily become addicted to. So should we be careful to kind of think that we're not susceptible to addiction?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And maybe it would be good to sort of ground some terms. So addiction is defined as the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. Sometimes that's a harm that we can see. Often it's a harm that others see that we don't see. Importantly, there's no blood test or brain scan to diagnose addiction. We base it on what we call phenomenology, or repeated patterns of behavior across different human temperaments, demographics, geographies, space, and time. And I'll use myself as an example. I used to think that I was immune to addiction, even though I have alcoholics in my family. And that's because alcohol really was never reinforcing for me, right? It just didn't make me feel good. Caffeine, likewise, my whole entire medical career, I've hoped that caffeine would be a stimulant for me, and I have zero response to it. I'm so bummed.
Really? Wow.
Right? It doesn't wake me up. So I thought, well, whatever that is, I don't have it. But it turns out I just hadn't yet met my drug of choice, which turns out to be romance novels, which I discovered in midlife, which is essentially socially sanctioned pornography for women, or at least that's what it became for me. I started with an innocent book, The Twilight Saga, and I just progressed over time to more and more potent versions. It started to interfere with my sleep, my being present for my family. It started to interfere with my work. All I wanted to do was read romance novels, this kind of narrowing of focus and inability to take joy in other activities, progressive depression, anxiety related to consumption of romance novels, excessive consumption. So, I think, this idea that addiction is something that happens to other people is really one that we need to do away with. Because this is right, it's right now and right of all of our lives. And these digital devices light up the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. When we are engaging with even just the screens themselves are like primordial fires, right? We're drawn to them. And then they're also a portal to these incredibly potent drugs, traditional drugs, but also drugs that never existed before, like video games, social media, online shopping, online gambling, online pornography. I mean, versions of those things have always existed, but one of the biggest risk factors for addiction is simple access. If you grow up in a neighborhood where drugs are sold and available on the street corner, you are more likely to try them and more likely to get addicted. We have lots of empirical evidence showing that. And now we live in a world where we're basically cybernetically enhanced. These devices are everywhere. And so I think most, if not all of us, are experiencing compulsive overconsumption of digital media and kind of wondering how to get out of that loop.
Are you seeing more of that in your clinical work?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting, as a clinician, who treats addiction, I sort of get a frontline view of sort of the latest addictions. I'm here in Silicon Valley. Addictions can be geographic, very geographic specific, but I think we're seeing what will eventually be seen everywhere. And it was pretty much in the early aughts, the early 2000s, we started to see more and more middle-aged men coming in with severe sex and pornography and compulsive masturbation addiction. I mean, we're talking life-threatening, like losing their jobs, losing their spouses, depressed, wanting to end their lives because of their addiction. And universally, they endorsed that it was the advent of the internet, and then in particular, the portability of the internet that really sent this, what had been a behavior that was reasonably manageable, into a behavior that became unmanageable. And then, shortly thereafter, we started seeing more gaming disorders, so video game disorders. And that was then followed by, and all through that was the online gambling, especially sports betting. It's amazing how the online sports betting has become a huge, huge problem. And then more recently, and then social media, and that's when we started to see more women, struggling. But interestingly, lately, it's become a more diffuse, just like internet addiction. So although people have preferred platforms, they're not just using it's sort of like just like the being online, right? Like it's YouTube, it's pornography, it's video games, it's social media. If it's not one thing, it's another. It's this kind of inability to unhook. And it's and I always like to sort of frame this discussion by saying, like, the vast majority of people who drink alcohol don't become alcoholics. It's about 10 to 15% lifetime prevalence who will exhibit alcoholic or alcohol addiction behaviors. And that's going to be true for digital devices and digital media. Most of us will see, oh, there's a problem here. I'm going to, self-correct. But I'm telling you, there's a subset. It's probably about 5 to 10% of individuals, including kids, for whom this medium is absolutely positively their drug of choice and devastating for their lives. And of course, very difficult to combat because it's so integrated into everything that we do.
How can you tell, or how can someone else tell if it is becoming a problem or if it's tending towards that direction? Like if I'm engaging with any type of internet, it sounds like kind of broadly described. How might I know, or how might my spouse know, or a friend of mine know if, like, oh my goodness, that is becoming a problem for that person?
Yeah. So we talk about looking for the 4 C's combined with tolerance and withdrawal, which are markers of physical dependence. The psychological dependence is part of it too. So the first C is control. So out of control use, continually planning to use a certain amount and finding that I'm using more, planning to read one chapter in my romance novel and then finding myself 3 hours later still reading my romance novel, right? Mm-hmm. So continue trying to cut back and not being successful. The second is craving. And craving can be intrusive thoughts or images of wanting to use. It can be a physiologic kind of cramping around thinking about use. It can be a complex narrative that rationalizes use, even though I told myself that I would cut back. The third thing can be compulsion. So this is a level of automaticity in our use. I'm sure many people have had this where they're like, I'm going to put my phone away. I'm not going to touch it. And then somehow in a dissociative state, 20 minutes later, find ourselves reaching for it. It's amazing.
Familiar.
Yeah. And it speaks to the elaborate neural networks that we evolved now, such that we are reflexively reaching for these devices. And then finally, the 4th C is consequences, especially continued use despite consequences. And sometimes, again, it's consequences. Sometimes that we see it, sometimes we don't. So those are the 4 C's: control, craving, compulsion, and consequences. Tolerance is another marker. That's needing more and more potent forms of our drug over time to get the same effect. So one drink doesn't do it. I need 4 or 5. The Twilight Saga, isn't sufficiently potent as a romance novel. I need to read 50 Shades of Grey, right? Which is much more graphic sex scenes. So potency is a big part of it. And for example, like when we treat pornography addiction, people will often describe a trajectory where they started out with kind of generic pornography and now they're watching really deviant forms and they sort of like, how did I get there type thing. So that's something to really look for. And then withdrawal. I'm noting that when we try to stop, we experience intense withdrawal. And remember, those withdrawal symptoms are first and foremost psychiatric symptoms: anxiety, depression, irritability, insomnia. The other soft sign that you won't read in a textbook, but which I think is really important to look for, is the lying habit. So what happens when we get in our addiction is we start lying about our consumption, right? Telling our spouse, I'm going to go for a walk, but really we're going to the corner to pull up a sports betting app to place a bet and then going back home again, right? Yeah. So the lying habit is really part and parcel of the disease of addiction. And what people with severe addiction will report is they start out lying about their use, but then they end up lying about what they had for breakfast. Like, it doesn't make any sense, but they just get in that lying habit, which is why when we're working with people in recovery, we actually prescribe radical honesty. We say to them, you can't tell a lie about anything. You can't tell, even not why you were 5 minutes late for a meeting. Not even a small thing. Not even a small thing, because once you start telling those small lies, that will trip you up into those bigger lies, and it will be more difficult. And I think that's really fascinating, the role of honesty in recovery and lying in addiction. I think it works on a lot of different levels, but one of the ways it works is that when people really get deep in their addiction and are lying about it, they develop this double life where they have this one persona and then they have this whole other life that other people don't know about. And the amazing thing is that the addict themselves doesn't really even know about their double life because they're not articulating the experience in language and communicating it. And when we don't put things into words, we they're outside of awareness, right? So it takes sort of articulating, telling people I did this for it to seem real to us.
Wow. I have so many questions based on what you just said, but the first one, I guess, is what would be a first step for me, if let's say I'm the person, I'm starting to notice, and I'll just give you an example from my life. And I appreciate, by the way, you sharing your own experience, not just now, but in the book. I thought that was really neat to hear you not just talk about the experience of your patients, but also your own experience. And I remember watching, like getting into Netflix, and I remember I would get like a show that I really liked. And the thing about Netflix or any of these streaming services is it's really just, it's crazy that they're all available to you. So it's like you watch one episode and even prompts you for the next one.
Right.
And so I found myself, I think I was in law school at the time. And of course, I had a lot of work to do for law school, but I would be into a particular show and I would stay up. I would intend to maybe just watch one episode, and next thing I know, I'm watching a second or third episode, and I'm staying up much later than I should, even to the point where I'm like hoping my wife, and it wasn't like I was watching anything that my wife wouldn't approve of, but just I didn't want her to realize that I was up so late, because she would probably be like, "Why are you up so late? You're in high school. You have to get up and do work tomorrow."
Right.
Yeah. And then I realized at the end, like I would finish a show and there would be this, and reading your work, I guess it would be described as pain, because I would like need to find a new show, because that show was so good. And I remember even Googling like, and this is embarrassing to admit, but like I really enjoyed Friday Night Lights. And I was like trying to find like, what is if you liked Friday Night Lights, what other show might you like?
Right.
So anyway,
which, by the way, the internet is genius at doing, right? That's exactly how their algorithm works. They don't even wait for you to look it up. They say, hey, you liked X, you'll probably like Y.
You'll probably, they knew you would be looking for this.
Right.
And so anyway, because obviously during that experience, I started to notice, I don't know in what part of the brain this was happening, but like, this is probably not me at my best self. Like I am in law school. I should probably be going to bed early, getting up early, reading, you know what I mean? Like this is probably just not my best way of operating.
Right. Yeah.
So if that's a person listening right now, or let's say you have someone in your life who you can just tell that like there's something that has control over them, even if it's a small thing, what would be a good first step to start, whether you're that person or you're someone who loves that person, like what's a good first step to start to make some progress in that area?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for sharing that. That's such a wonderful, vivid, relatable example. Because I think, that experience is something that we can really all relate to on some level. So one of the very first and important steps is just simply identifying the behavior, right? Identifying it. And one of the ways to do that is to actually tell another human being. So, if you have a behavior that you on some level think, oh, gee, I'm not sure that's really how I want to be spending my time, tell another human that you trust and you care about. And in the process of describing that behavior, of course, you're communicating to them what you did, but mostly you're communicating to yourself, because it is really remarkable how we can dissociate from those behaviors and tell ourselves that we're either not doing them or we're not doing them to the extent that we think we are. It's incredibly powerful. Another thing can be very useful is something called the regret principle, to really add up the number of hours per day that we're spending doing that, or the amount of alcohol we're drinking, or the amount of cannabis we're consuming, or whatever it is, and just look at it over a week. That week timeline is sort of a retrospective, is kind of a nice sort of finite amount of time where you go, wow, I actually am spending, 4 hours a day, watching Netflix. Like I didn't really think it was that much, but if I'm being totally honest, I got home at 8, I got on Netflix at 9, 10, 11, and I was up till 1 a.m. and I've done that, almost every night. So that can be a real aha moment when you sort of look at it in aggregate, super powerful. Just again, relating my own story, like I would kind of joke occasionally, oh, I'm addicted to romance novels, ha, ha, ha. But I didn't really look at the behavior, because if I really looked at it, I'd have to consider stopping. But then I was in an interactive exercise with some psychiatry residents, and we were one person short. So I had to play the patient, and this wonderful psych resident said, we teach them this motivational. I mean, what's a behavior you'd like to change? And I said, and I hadn't planned this. So I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'd like to change some of my late night reading habit, right? I didn't go into any detail.
Yeah.
Well, what I was reading, that would have been so creepy. But anyway, he's like, okay, well, tell me about that. So I told him about that. He said, well, what's one thing you can do to change that? And I said, well, I could probably get rid of my Kindle, my e-reader, because that's allowing me to just, kind of like Netflix, as soon as you're done with one, you just go on Amazon and get another one. But the real point here is that the next day, I kept thinking about that conversation.
Oh, wow.
And although I was still reading romance novels the very next day, I was reading and I was watching myself read at the same time. So all of a sudden, I was observing that behavior, no longer in ignorance, but like, yeah, I don't want to be doing this. Like I'm spending a lot of time doing this. I do want to change this behavior.
Can you talk about that? Because it sounds like what you're describing in the book, I think you define that as mindfulness. Is that our ability to look with our brain, at our thinking,
right.
which I loved how you described kind of the Milky Way and how, isn't it interesting that we can look at the Milky Way, but we're a part of that.
Yes.
So it's just this weird dynamic that we have the capacity to look at our own thinking and to kind of examine ourselves. What is that, first of all, and what role does that play in being a healthy person?
Yeah. So, I mean, mindfulness is adapted from Eastern Buddhist traditions. It's broadly described as the ability to observe our thoughts and feelings without judgment. So it's like, oh, gross. Why did I think that? You just got to go, oh, I'm going to be curious about that. And also without running away from those thoughts and feelings. So when it comes to these compulsive, overconsumptive behaviors or addictive behaviors, mindfulness becomes important on many levels. Just being able to allow ourselves to observe the behavior and be honest with ourselves and others about what we're actually doing, as well as begin to observe the things like craving, right? When we're not using and how we want to use, or what you were able to observe. So what you described was a really great example of mindfulness, where you would be in basically a dissociative flow state or transported state watching, but then as soon as it was over, you were consumed with craving and wanting to find another show. And so your ability to both engage in that sort of craving pursuit behavior, but also watching yourself do that and go, wow, that's kind of weird. Like I didn't watch the show and then feel sated. I watched the show and felt I want more show. And that's those kinds of things are essentially the practice of mindfulness, right? Our ability to observe these phenomena in ourselves, and not like be repulsed or self-loathing, not to be consumed with shame, even though some of the behaviors really may be shameful for us. But instead just be like, oh, okay, I do that thing.
Can you talk about the difference between shame and guilt and how that plays out just in our own observing of ourselves and how we kind of interact, not just with ourselves, I guess, but also with community? Because you do a good job in the book of laying out the power of community in helping us recover and helping us kind of stay on the path that we want to be. Like for me, I've been able to talk to my wife about Netflix and just like acknowledge like, hey, I'm actually, and it really wasn't so much her telling me, it was more just me asking her for some accountability. Like,
right.
I have acknowledged that this is not the way I want to spend my time. I'd rather go to sleep. I'd rather read a book. I'd rather just be with our kids or just have a conversation with you. And so I'm only going to watch Netflix. I've kind of set a rule for myself that Friday nights after the work week, I can watch like a movie, and I'm not too restrictive about it, but it just really helps me kind of keep it constrained. Right. Same for social media. Like I am no longer on Facebook, no longer on Instagram. No, I never got on TikTok. I am on LinkedIn, but I don't have the apps on my phone just because I started to notice I was spending more time than I wanted to spend. So anyway, those are just some examples, but I think having community and kind of being able to acknowledge some of the guilt I was feeling and but I don't think for the most part, I don't think it was shame, but I do think a lot of us probably at times really feel shame, and that can be unproductive. So I wonder if you could just kind of talk about the difference between shame and guilt and how that can play out in community.
Yeah, so I don't actually see too much difference between shame and guilt. I will tell you that often it's defined as shame is loathing yourself,
Okay.
and guilt is loathing something that you did,
Okay.
which I think can be, a helpful way of sort of parsing that emotion. But I think at the end of the day, when I feel shame, it's not any different than when I feel guilt. I just feel really bad.
Experience it the same.
Yeah, experientially, I think it's very similar, and it's really a gut punch of an emotion. It's a very old emotion, and it's fundamentally a necessary emotion, because if we didn't feel shame for certain behaviors, we would not be motivated to change them. So I think instead of thinking of shame as like, oh, people shouldn't feel shame because shame is hurts and you don't want to have more pain. It's like, hey, if my conscience is telling me that I'm feeling shame, like that's an important piece of information that I should probably pay attention to, and use that to inform, what I do, instead of trying to run away from that feeling by drowning in more pleasurable escapist types of behaviors. There's no doubt that people who get very addicted experience intense shame, and that shame can be so paralyzing for them that it just perpetuates the addictive cycle. I call it a destructive shame. Sometimes it's called malignant shame. That's not helpful. But if we find a way to, as you did, to express the feeling and then make behavior change to do better, right? To change the behavior that's causing us to feel shame, then shame becomes a potentially very pro-social, positive, propelling force. But that's only going to happen if we're in a community that accepts us for who we are and believes that we can do better. So if we express shame, transgressive behaviors in a community that then does nothing but punish and shun us, that's hard, because that's going to make us not want to communicate and just perpetuate the shame cycle. But if we're in a community like Alcoholics Anonymous, in other words, where people say, hey, I'm an alcoholic. Hey, I'm an alcoholic too. So we're all alcoholics, right? But here's the thing. If you come to these meetings, if you do the 12 steps, like you can stop doing those behaviors, and, we will help you do that. Now you've got a pro-social shame phenomenon going on where people start to get like, wow, I'm feeling so good about myself. I would feel shameful if I had to go back to an AA meeting and talk about having relapsed. And wanting to avoid that shame is part of what motivates me to continue to abstain, right? So it's a really fascinating double-edged sword. Shame can drive the addictive behaviors, but it can also be the salvation of those addictive cycles, as long as you're in a community that provides a path for making amends. A kind of post-shame to-do list is really the key here.
Can you talk about the relationship between some of these dopamine-inducing behaviors and our ability to enjoy just kind of the mundane things of life? Because I noticed that, things that you think would just be like, oh, I just want to sit and read a book. I really enjoy that. And then all of a sudden you start to get more and more into these digital devices, and then it just seems like, oh, the things that I used to enjoy doing are not quite as enjoyable. But actually those things that are the simple things in life are really the things that I most value, like at a deep level, but these other things are keeping me from doing that. So what does that relationship look like? And if we are kind of caught up in these dopamine inducing behaviors, is it possible to regain our appreciation for waking up in the morning and just going for a walk outside without my phone and watching the sunrise?
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
this is such an important point and such a subtle, insidious part of being alive in the world today, that we literally physiologically are changing our hedonic or joy set point by living in a world where we're inundated with easy, potent pleasures. And when I say change that hedonic set point, I'm referring to that pleasure-pain balance tilted to the side of pain, such that now I have more difficulty accessing any pleasure at all, but I'm very vulnerable to pain. Wow. And this comes up a lot in life today. So for example, I had a patient, a young man who went away to college, got very addicted to video games, had to drop out of school because he was suicidal, came in, was depressed, suicidal, said nothing interested him. He had been so excited to go to college and be a computer science major. And, when he got there, just started playing more and more video games, up all night, playing, not going to class in the day, and eventually decided, I'm not interested in computer science. I don't want to be in college. I don't want to live. So he came to me, and I see this a lot when young people, it's like, if only I could find my passion, if only I could find, the thing I really want to do, then, it would be so much better. Like other people, it's like, well, here's the thing. If you are playing potent video games all day long, nothing else is going to be interesting because you are changing your hedonic set point. And so, computer science is going to, there's no competing with that, right? So what we did was we did a dopamine fast with him. He eliminated all devices for a month, felt so much better a month thereafter, decided to continue on in that path. He was in a special situation. He had dropped out of school, living at home, had been very depressed. So this was an extreme version of a dopamine fast, not just video games, but all devices, kind of rediscovered his grounded self, less depressed, less anxious. We got him 2 separate laptops, one for work and one for video games when he eventually went back to video games, just like how you limited Netflix to 1 day per week, one show. He was going to limit video games to 2 days per week, no more than 2 hours a day, only playing with friends, not with strangers, not playing League of Legends. So all kinds of what we call self-binding strategies, try to maintain it. And then he went back to school and he was like, Dr. Lembke, I'm really enjoying my computer science classes. Wow. So, this is so powerful and so subtle. How we can really change that hedonic set point. Speaking of which, basic training in the military. My daughter went through it. Yeah. Very hard, a real state of deprivation. And, when it was over and they went on they had a cross-country meet and she went to a hotel, she's like, Mom, the beds are so soft, right? So for her, it was like
little things.
Yeah, just like sleeping in a soft bed was just absolute heaven. Now, these are things we've known for centuries, right? We know this, right? Plato talked about this, on the heels of pleasure comes pain, on the heels of pain come pleasure. But we've really forgotten it as a community and as a society. And it's very difficult because we're constantly being invited to consume. We're told culturally that if we're not happy and if we're experiencing any kind of pain, we must be sick. Something's wrong with us. We need to go see the doctor. So it's really hard to kind of remember what we used to know about the relationship between pleasure and pain.
It's really interesting to hear you describe it. I remember when I kind of stopped getting on social media as much, it was this weird phenomenon where I actually wanted to call people more and I wanted, I developed this capacity more to just sit with people. Yeah. I didn't understand it, but I did notice it. I remember where in the past I would just get on Facebook and like scrolling and seeing what people were doing, felt like I connected with them, but I really didn't because there was no actual interaction. It was just me seeing this thing that they were doing, but it wasn't an actual conversation.
Right.
And I remember even sitting with my grandmother, who at the time I think was like 100 years old. And of course, she just loves sitting and just having a conversation. That's very normal to her.
Yeah.
But for me, someone who was just going at a very high rate, that was kind of hard to do. Even though I love my grandmother, it was just hard to sit for an hour and just have a conversation without any stimulus. So I just thought that was nice to be able to get back to what felt at a deep level, something I really wanted to be able to experience, but was hard for me to experience. And I didn't really understand why. And you had this wonderful part in the book, and I want to just quote it because it really resonated with me. And you have this patient who comes into your office, and in the book, her name is Sophie, a Stanford undergraduate who was seeking help for depression and anxiety. And she told you that she spends most of her waking hours on her device, scrolling Instagram, YouTubing, listening to podcasts. And then you suggested that she just try walking to class without listening to anything and just kind of let her own thoughts pop up. And she said, well, but it's just so boring. And you said, and I love this response, you said, but boredom is not just boring, it can be terrifying. Mm-hmm. And it forces us to come face to face with bigger questions of meaning and purpose. But boredom is also an opportunity for discovery and invention. It creates the space necessary for a new thought to form, without which we're endlessly reacting to stimuli around us rather than allowing ourselves to be within our lived experience. And so I wonder if you could speak to that, because when we start to use some of these recommendations to create space, to limit some of these dopamine-inducing activities, we might be left with boredom, which can be, as you say, terrifying. Now I'm stuck with my thoughts. What do I do?
Yeah.
I don't like some of it. It's bringing up things about my past maybe, or I'm having to deal with some of my natural struggles. What would you say? Speak into that. What do we do with the boredom that might come when we start to maybe live in a healthier way?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's so important to acknowledge that boredom is scary, and it's really an existential state, because if I don't have anything to do, I feel very untethered to my life, right? It's like, well, why am I here at all? You can have real kind of sensation of derealization or depersonalization. I'm not real. The world's not real. We're seeing more and more of that, by the way, in clinical care. But here's the thing, that feeling of like intense negative rumination, boredom, discomfort, that is in large part withdrawal from the hyperstimulation and all the dopamine. And that means it's time limited. And if we can just continue to abstain from that reinforcing substance or behavior for 10 to 14 days, our brains will eventually calm down enough where we will be able to be in a kind of mental state that is, in fact, potentially very joyful and calm and settled and quiet. And also a state where we have a real opportunity for insight and creativity, which is, by the way, less likely and less possible when we're constantly in reactive mode, constantly responding to external stimuli. And there's been some really interesting neuroscientific work on this, looking at the difference in brain activation when we're responding to external stimuli versus when we're sitting quietly. And that sitting quiet state, often referred to by neuroscientists as the default mode network, or the DMN, it's characterized by actually a kind of a synchronous symphony of brain activation across many different parts of the brain, consolidating a lot of our rich sensory, emotional, and cognitive experience, allowing us to integrate it all so that we can really have a sense of our past, current, and future selves, and gain wisdom and insight, which we really don't have access to when we're just constantly going bing, 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 reacting to everything around us. So at first it hurts. There's no doubt about it. And it's uncomfortable. But stay with it. Have faith that by continuing to live in that quieter way, you will get to a place where you will experience some deep connection with yourself, with others, with the universe. It's a very cool thing.
You talk in the book about, I think you recommend, at least in one of the examples, 30 days is the period of abstaining. And then you just mentioned it's, I think, 14 days. Is there a time period that you would recommend? Like, let's say you're talking to me, 10 years ago when I'm in law school and struggling with Netflix. Is there a period you would have recommended to me to say, hey, Cal, take however many days and just abstain from Netflix before it starts to get easier to live with that boredom?
Yeah, so that's essentially what we do. We recommend that people identify what is the specific problematic behavior, and that they try a dopamine fast from that specific behavior. So if it's pornography, In masturbation, that would be no orgasms with yourself or others and no pornography for 30 days. If it's alcohol, no cannabis, no romance novels, no Netflix. So you identify the behavior. You're mindful that you don't replace another behavior that's potentially addictive with that behavior, 'cause that happens, cross addiction. You recognize, and why do we recommend 30 days? Because on average, and we see a lot of different types of addictions, a lot of different, histories of chronicity and severity, but remarkably 30 days on average is what it takes for those gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for us to begin to reset reward pathways. That doesn't mean that like people are cured of their addiction by abstaining for 30 days, not at all. And in fact, for some patients, it's not the right recommendation. For example, patients who have repeatedly tried to quit on their own and been unable to, patients who are at risk of life-threatening alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal. But most patients that we see in our outpatient clinic can, if they choose to, stop for 30 days. And it's just an awesome experiment because although they feel worse before they feel better by days 3 or 4, they're able to take joy in more modest rewards. They're out of that constant state of craving, where they're always thinking about and wanting the drug. That means they can look back at their more addicted selves and get clarity. Oftentimes people will talk about a kind of surreal experience of not recognizing that person who was investing so much in getting and using the drug. And, that can be shame inducing. It's like, wow, I so overvalued this stimulus. I had no perspective. Now I've taken a break and I can look back and say, that was kind of crazy, right? So it is a kind of a crazy state that we can get into, and then we can't see it for what it is. So that distance helps with that. And then even if the long-term goal is to go back to watching Netflix or go back to playing video games or go back to smoking a little bit of pot, we're much more likely to be successful in reducing and moderating our use if we first had that period of 30 days of abstinence to reset reward pathways. And by the way, if you look at almost every major religious tradition, there's a period of fasting that is about 30 days, whether it's Lent or Ramadan or what have you. And I think that's the collective wisdom of many generations of humans who have realized, 30 days is about the time it takes to start to reset dopamine reward pathways. So I think it's interesting the way that neuroscience is now sort of validating what philosophers and theologians have said for thousands of years. So that's what we recommend. And then when people go back to deciding to use, we recommend making a very specific plan of how much, how often, how am I going to be accountable? What are my red flags? As you did, you said, okay, well, I'm going to watch Netflix, but I'm only going to do it on this day and I'm only going to do this much and I'm going to tell my wife about it and things like that.
One of the things I really have picked up on and appreciate about you and your work is that I can just tell you have a level of love and respect for your patients that's really neat to see. And you talk about how your patients are like modern day prophets and are really, when we see someone go from having a real struggle to going through the therapy and then going through the intervention and then experiencing success, we can learn a lot from that, especially now, as we described at the beginning of this conversation, we now live in a different world where we are all, not that we weren't maybe before, but now for sure, like we're all kind of struggling or we have the capacity to struggle in ways that maybe we didn't in the past. And so what are some commonalities between those who do experience success, who come in, you sit with them, go through the process, and then on the back end, they're really thriving, they're doing well. What are some common things that you see in them that you could share with us?
Oh gosh, what a great question. So many commonalities. It's really fascinating how across many different individuals, the themes of recovery are so similar. Things like being able to show up for my life and be fully present, for the life that I've been given, the ability to feel gratitude for that life, the lessening of FOMO or fear of missing out, no longer feeling like I should always be someplace else, doing someplace else, but like I'm in my body, I'm in my life, a kind of, gratitude for other people that we have in our lives and the ability to connect to those people and make, deep emotional connections. Spiritual pathways are very, very common for people in recovery, kind of a different orientation, on the universe, and especially a profound humility, a recognition that we're all deeply flawed and broken in our own ways. And, we come to this life just sort of beggars, really, on our knees. And so incredible humility and empathy for others. And frankly, just a whole lot of joy, right? An ability to recapture joy in our lives. So it's very cool.
Last question, Anna, and I know you have kids, and it was neat in your book to hear about just some of the strategies that you implement in your own parenting. What advice, just pulling from your experience, pulling from your work, time writing this book, what advice would you have for parents or people who just care about the next generation and are trying to help coach and lead children who are also in a world that we've never experienced before? Any advice for those who kind of are trying to help kids navigate the modern world? Yeah.
So, lots of things to say there, but just to name a few. Number one, model the behavior you want your children to exhibit. So we get a lot of parents who say, my kid's on their device, too much. And then even within that session, the parent's on their device, so we definitely need to model that behavior. Encourage truth-telling as a fundamental value for its own sake, and that the idea that being honest, although it can be painful in the short term, actually gives us a much better life and more intimacy and connection to the people around us. So that's a very important family ethic or family value. And then really recognizing the dopamine overload of this modern world, and to some extent trying to make your family life insulated from that, especially for younger children, especially when it comes to digital devices. And knowing that you can, if you give a device, you give it to take it away. And if your kid is not using it responsibly, don't hesitate to get in there and be counterculture and take that device away. Even if your kid tells you, everybody else has it. And well, you know what? We're going to try not doing that. Because it will really lay a foundation for your kid to be able to make informed choices when they are free to choose. And they may choose to be on their device a lot, right? But at least they have a background of knowing what felt different when they weren't doing that. And just really again, emphasizing a kind of pro-social shame through encouraging radical honesty, that when our kids come to us and they say that they've done something that, we don't approve of, to kind of validate, that's too bad. That's not okay. I'm glad you told me, that's not okay that you did that. I wonder how you might change that behavior. I wonder how you might make amends to those you've harmed. So again, I think there's a kind of a sense, there has been a sense in modern parenting that we want to insulate our kids from any kind of negative emotions. But trust me, that is not how we want to raise kids. We want our kids to feel those difficult and painful emotions, which means that we have to feel them too and allow our kids to have that experience, which is hard because, of course, we want to protect them. But if we overprotect them and if we let them, not have the natural consequences of their behavior, they're really not going to learn. And that means when they get to be adults, they're not going to be able to make good choices.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for writing this book. I encourage everyone. It is such an easy read. I love how you weave in wonderful stories and you weave in the science and you weave in practical application and your own stories. So thank you for writing. I can't imagine how much time it must have taken to write this book and make it such a compelling read. I know that writing well and can in a compelling way, at least it's not easy for me.
Yeah, me either. It's not easy. Hard work.
Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. I hope everyone will go check it out. And I guess last word, where can people connect with you and your work and follow what you're doing?
Well, probably the best way to connect is to read the book. I'm not on social media. I never did join it. I just knew I wouldn't be able to handle it. We are coming out with a Dopamine Nation workbook, the official Dopamine Nation workbook. There are some fake workbooks online, but we're coming out with a real workbook that helps people. You asked about what are specific exercises. So this kind of walks people through specific activities they can do to identify and overcome all forms of compulsive overconsumption.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. So nice to meet you.
All right. Well, thank you for sticking around to the end. The topics we talked about today are really important to me as someone trying to create a life that aligns with my deepest values and someone trying to help my kids navigate a world that we've never experienced before. If you were watching on YouTube, I want to ask you what resonated the most from this conversation. Let me know in the comments below. And if you got something out of this conversation and have not left a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please take 60 seconds and leave a rating or review. That really means a lot to me. And I highly recommend Dr. Lembke's book. It's been one of my favorite reads this year. Very compelling and an easy read. Friend, thanks so much for investing in yourself and your leadership today. As you head out, keep being intentional and looking for ways to encourage people around you. Remember that life is short. Let's go make it count.